Andy Kirkland, welcome back to the Talent Equation. Long overdue second conversation. Looking forward to this.
It is. When was it that I was last on? Was it 2020 or
Could well have been.
2021? Yeah,
It feels very, very close to, yes, when we were all online, lockdown, and all that sort of stuff. And you'd been doing some reflection, and The Emperor's New Clothes you'd just published. And so we had a bit of a conversation about that.
absolutely. I didn't believe what happened as a result of writing that piece. It's probably uh, reached so many people. I even recruited people for the MSc that I work on in performance coaching as a result of that article. And saying, who is this guy? They spoke to me and then enrolled in our program. Uh, Australian Institute of Sport was in touch. You were in touch. I upset a few people, I think is fair to say. Uh, but the it's probably the biggest impact in anything I've done was writing that piece.
Well, before we dive into that, plus other subjects, because you haven't sat still. You've been busy. You've been writing various things,
Mm,
and I think there may even be an Emperor's Two coming out, which we might want to speak to a little bit.
hmm
Um, some people may not have caught that initial episode because they're only just starting to listen. So I wonder if
absolutely.
you wouldn't mind just giving the quick intro of your background, really.
Oh, how to do that? So I like to think of myself as a bit of a coaching anthropologist. That's a clever way of saying that I'm interested in everything relating to sport and coaching. Uh, I'm a lecturer at the University of Stirling, primarily on our performance coaching master's program. So I've got the joy, and I do mean joy, of working with uh, developing coaches, some working in professional domains at the highest level of sport through to people working in grassroots clubs. So it really suits me. I love the diversity of the types of coaches I work with. Uh, I'm also a triathlon coach. I limit myself to working with one professional athlete because that's enough for anyone. Um, so that's an important part of what I do, just to keep myself uh, as close to the coalface as possible, whilst uh, still playing golf and walking the dog and having a relatively balanced life. That's really important to me as well, that uh, my life isn't completely about sport. I think the dog is the priority in my life, but don't tell my partner that.
I shouldn't giggle. Might be signaling something myself. I so uh, I'm yeah. So just to circle back a little bit to the central thesis of the Emperor's New Clothes, you'd basically, you were, I guess, questioning the sort of system that existed and some of the changes to the landscape that were being made and all of those things in terms of where we were with sort of coaching policy, coaching development systems. Have we really moved on? Are we just doing the same sort of thing and all that sort of stuff? So, um, that it was just I thought it was a really interesting discussion. And of course, I was in the middle of it as a policymaker, so I was interested in speaking to you,
Yeah.
and obviously wanted to talk a little bit about that. So yeah, just a quick, I don't know, reflections since then, really, because obviously we're 5 years on, things have
Um,
changed. So, or have
uh,
they? Who knows?
oh, they have and they haven't. I think my perspective in writing it was partly emotional, in that, is angry the right word? I don't think angry is the right word. Maybe frustrated with the system. I've also reflected on my life course through sport as well, and thought about my experiences in and through sport, uh, and how that reflected my views on the system. And an important part of that is, and probably I was probably the sort of kid that Sport England, Sport Scotland wanted to engage with, so not wholly engaged in education, living on a council estate, uh, overweight, not overly physically active. And sport became everything for me as I grew older. And it took me from being an underachiever or someone that didn't prosper in a conventional education system to someone who I think it's fair to say I've been relatively successful, that I've worked for British Cycling. I've coached some really good athletes. I've worked with uh, a few Olympians. I've coached in grassroots clubs. Uh, so that sport is the essence of who I am. It's where I've grown from. And it's really important to me. So everything I do, I don't think it's virtue signaling. Everything I do is for people uh, that may be experiencing things like I did when I was a child. Uh, there's a recognition that sport can change lives for the better. It can help people grow. Uh, it can give them opportunities that they wouldn't necessarily have in wider society. And that's what sport gave me. Uh, and maybe I'm a little bit OCD. Used to be really, really driven as well to making a difference. And being part of the system, so working at British Cycling, working in an institute of sport, like many others, I'm sure you've done it as well. You've questioned, am I being effective? Is the system being effective? Are we making a difference? And my conclusion was, in many cases, we're making things worse rather than better. We're not necessarily providing the right foundations for people to prosper in and through sport. Uh, and the consequences for those working in high performance domains, an environment that I've worked in as well, uh, we hear the glory stories, but the reality in working in these environments, uh, the wider public, even academics, which I am now one of, don't necessarily hear about those stories, the lived experiences of individuals. It's not something that's reported in literature. It's only things that are reported in the Times or the Daily Mail, where there's readers to grab through, well, the recent one in swimming, for example, in Portsmouth, Leander. The papers love these things. Uh, I would suggest that uh, working in some of these environments, uh, they don't know half of it.
Mm.
Uh, but there are good things that happen in those environments too, and that's the world that I've existed in for over 20 years now. Uh, and uh, I've really questioned hard, having committed my career and seeing other really great people committing their careers to making a difference, and they're not making a difference because there's wider constraints within those systems that are maybe preventing people from growing and making as much as a difference as they could. And I also think it reflects poor use of government money as well.
So you just mentioned constraints, and I think I have a decent amount of sympathy with, or at least I think I resonate with what you're saying about some of the constraints on the system, because I don't. I agree with your thesis in many ways. I don't necessarily think it's because the world of sport is full of bad people. I think
No,
most people who
absolutely
work in
not.
sport are doing so with the best of intentions. I just think that they are constrained. And there's lots of different ways the constraints materialize. But I'd love to just hear your sort of position on that a little bit.
Mm, I'm thinking I'm going to sound like an academic and say it's complicated and multifaceted and all these words, but it is. Uh, I'll use an example. So I posted on LinkedIn last week or something about the experiences of sports scientists in football academies, how uh, they're often paid minimum wage. Uh, and someone who will remain nameless reached out to me for a chat who's in that environment and has come into academia as well and just wanted to have a chat like we are chatting now about my perspective. And I'm saying, well, these sports scientists are being asked to go into what they believe to be an elite sporting environment. I would question the use of that term elite because they're not but expected to go into an elite environment with an undergraduate degree, a master's degree, at least a UEFA B license that's cost them a fortune to get. Then they're paid less than they would get paid in Tesco's, and the head coach doesn't value them. They're not able to have an impact using their practices. And what are the reasons? Well, of course, it's complex. Many of them are typically young men, but occasionally young women too, with limited experience. They've gone through an educational journey that has promoted a particular philosophical way of thinking about performance in which you measure things in a particular way without considering the social context in which these measurements take place, and the fact that it's the head coach or the gaffer that makes the decisions and needs to use that information if it's to be useful. And these coaches have often gone through problematic coach education journeys. uh, they may lack the wider skills and knowledge of how to use sports science data. So we've got underpaid practitioners trying to deliver stuff uh, to people who are not able to use that stuff. Uh, and there's wider policy factors that influence why that's the case. So the SFA and the FA dictating that academies must employ sport scientists to achieve academy status when the clubs don't see the value or benefit for these people. So everyone's a loser in that case. The teams aren't necessarily coherent, so the coaches aren't working with the sports scientists. There may not be a multidisciplinary team approach in which we're aggregating the data from multiple sources, and lots of resource is being wasted, all the while athletes are continually being poked and prodded and measured as almost experiments. Uh, they're not necessarily seen as human beings, they're seen as inputs and outputs of the system. Now, we're going to talk about a book I've written a chapter on in a second, I believe. But the editor of that book, Andy Borey, has talked about similar experiences as a performance director and such in sport, and has shown that, well, of those that come into some sort of academy structure in the Olympic sports, the funded sports, 0.2% uh, of the people that come onto a national governing body performance program will go to the Olympics. We know in football academies the statistic is less. It's less than 0.1%. Is it 0.001%? Something like that. I can't remember. Uh, so the question is, who's sport actually for? What are we trying to achieve? What what are we expecting coaches to do? Are we preparing them to work in their particular context? And what's the output from the coaching? And if we buy into this performance narrative, and the purpose is for people to progress to a professional contract or to win at the Olympics, well, the system's failing in that regard, isn't it? Because we've got a tiny proportion that'll go there. And what the numbers are showing now, you'll be more informed on those numbers than I am, but participation rates are struggling. Uh, New coaches coming into coaching uh, are lower than they've been for a while. I've heard about you talking on your dog walk chat about you not coaching in a particular environment. Uh, and I think you're quite representative of lots of coaches saying, I've had enough of this. It's just too hard. I'm too busy in the rest of my life, and I'm continually fighting to stop bad things happening rather than using my energy to make good things happen. And I think broadly, it sounds really negative. I don't think I'm being negative. I'm just being realistic that too much energy within our system is spent trying to stop bad things happening rather than using it to promote what sport's about. And it's about uh, giving people healthy experiences that encourages them to want to continue uh, to do that. So participation rates go up if people are enjoying it. And yeah, if we want to call them the cream will still rise to the top. We'll have a greater population base uh, competing for the same amount of chances to perform at the very highest level, and that everyone's a winner. And we can create these, and I genuinely believe we can create environments in which we can support those who simply want to participate and have a nice time and want to come back, and also support those who have got aspirations to perform at the very highest level. But we also need to have critical conversations with parents, athletes, quangos about the chances of what we consider to be successful. Not selling the dream, it's selling the experience rather than selling the dream. That sport can be deeply meaningful and positive uh, for many people, but I kind of think the system is making things worse rather than making things better.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly for me, I think you might be right, but I think the conditions for change are there. This has been my thesis for a while, and my recent sort of murmurings have been along these lines. I think the conditions for change are there, and the foundations are in place. It just needs people to grab them and take them in order to create the environments that we're looking for, which requires a change of thinking, which is now becoming a central feature of what I talk about on the podcast, because I kind of want to open people's or help people to see some alternatives, some different paths. So you made reference to the book you've written a chapter in, and that one of the things that the book is, I'm really interested in as well, was that it's reimagining talent development in sport. So Talent Equation podcast is all about that. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind just sort of sharing a bit about, like, what the sort of the central thesis of the book, and then let's delve into your chapter, because I think there's a lot of really good themes that can emerge from
Mm.
that we can
Uh,
then frame our conversation around.
yeah, that's the best way to do it because I emailed the editor last week, Andy, saying my copy's not arrived, and it arrived on Saturday morning. And I've been frantically trying to read a very interesting and insightful but academic book all the same over the weekend, and I've failed miserably. Uh, so the thesis of the book is that kind of what I've said there, that the system isn't being successful. We're shortchanging young people in and through sport. We're selling often a non-existent dream in which lots of people buy into that wider narrative, and it's not necessarily uh, that healthy for them. And Andy and Emily Ryle got together a very different but like-minded group of people to write individual chapters, which reflects both practice, so it's not a bunch of esoteric academics using big Bordusian words to confuse the hell out of everyone. At least all of the time. There's some of these in there, and I use some of them too. Uh, it's a group of people who are calling for change uh, through an evidence-guided approach. I use evidence-guided rather than evidence-based.
Mhm.
I'm saying there are alternatives. Uh, the thesis is basically we've got to stop selling the dream of talent development pathways and think about some of the assumptions of talent development pathways. Uh, Challenge those assumptions because most of them don't hold true. It challenging the narrative that we hear some of our sporting heroes talk about on the BBC or whatever when they're talking about sacrifice, extreme work ethic, giving up everything for sport, and saying, actually, no, there's other people that don't sacrifice everything. They've got a life outside of sport as well as in sport that can succeed. Too. We don't have to promote this narrative that we see. Well, I'm a big fan of Denise Lewis, for example, but interviews like that saying, "Oh, you must have sacrificed so much to win this medal." I'm thinking, uh, sport's never been a sacrifice for me. I love what I do. Tonight I'll be on the bike again, self-flagellating myself, absolutely killing myself because I love it. I'll be out on the golf course playing golf because there's a great joy in playing and doing sport. So why is sacrifice so embedded within that wider narrative of sport when we know that when identity or individual's identity is so contingent on sport that when that's the case, uh, issues emerge from that, usually relating to mental health. And if we recognize that in that context where we define success by uh, ultimate performance, the vast majority of people are going to fail within that narrative through injury, through becoming disengaged, through not loving their sport anymore. Um, got to think, what actually does success look like? What is talent? How does talent develop, and how does it emerge? And how can we support environments to allow people to adapt and grow and maintain that love of sport that I'm talking about? Playing golf is a joy for me now. Uh, and let me see, is it Katrina Douglas, for example, wrote a chapter on her experiences as a professional golfer and how a lot of that was contingent on who she was as a golfer, talks about these things. Uh, and others on tour saying, I don't want to be here anymore. I don't want to do this. They might have succeeded at a very high level, but they just don't want to be there anymore. It's kind of why. Uh, I've worked with a number of athletes too that have said I've fallen out of love of my sport through being on the program, on a performance program. We're talking on podium programs, those with potential to perform at the highest level, and say, I don't like it anymore.
Mm.
We need to challenge that.
So I have spoken several times on this podcast and beyond.
Mm,
Um, I met Katrina a number of years ago when I was working in golf, and she did open my eyes actually, because this was a good number of years ago now, but was talking about some of her personal experiences, and it did resonate quite a lot. And the irony of that, of course, was I was in a role that was designing pathways at the time. So,
mm,
I was kind of as sort of steeped in the ideas of pathways, because these were the early days of golf didn't have a pathway. So the idea was we'd have to create a pathway for golf, because without a pathway, how could golf ever develop? Um, and there's lots of other there's lots of things about that interesting about. I guess the question I've got is, I want to dive into your chapter a little bit, but there's an immediate question that emerges in my mind, and I imagine other people ask, will go, well, what's the alternative? And I think I've been guilty in the past, particularly with, say, things like coach education is broken, all those sorts of things, of sort of
mm,
lamenting the existing system, which is easy to do. But I'd be interested in what are the alternatives? What are the things that we can consider in a reimagine? Because there's always going to be people who want to be able to sort of self-actualize through sport. They're trying to achieve something within the sporting domain, or trying to become
mm.
the best versions of themselves in these worlds. Um, and whatever we think about that pursuit and the potential pros and cons of it, that's something that's always going to be there. And a way of allocating resources to support that journey is something that most sporting organizations see it as their role to do,
Absolutely, absolutely.
and they want to do it as well as they can. I think they are basing the way they do it on some broken assumptions, and I think there's some ways we could probably start to explore all of that. But I'd just be interested in your thoughts on, what we could do differently.
Mm. Yeah, I'm shifting my glasses and sighing and going, oh, well, in the book that Andy suggests that they're not really presenting solutions because it's really complex, and I'm not uh, on my dog walking journeys as well. That's where I do a lot of my thinking, in fact, as you do. I'm thinking, oh, what would I do? And I was thinking about that this morning as well. And there was a tension within my mind between what's ideal and what's realistic. So, what are the systems in place? How do people within these systems behave, think, act? What's their levels of capability? How do they see the world? And there, basically the dominant power. And here's just Andy Kirkland having a whine about stuff on the other end that through conversations like this, we can shift the dial a little bit. Within that power dynamic, how do we make change happen? And the honest answer is I've not got a bloody clue. Um, from my way of thinking, and I've spoken to a number of uh, people in coach education asking exactly that question. How would you use resources uh, in terms of coach education? And I said, well, we give and this broadly aligned to some of the things that were done at Sport England as well, is let's give a very basic experience to the wider market, just an entry level uh, tick a box to get insurance, uh, and uh, then those that demonstrate a desire and capability to go further, to invest heavily in a group of individuals who are head coaches in key clubs who have the drive to influence others and work closely with them, maybe on a program like I deliver at University of Stirling, quite a holistic, integrative type program to develop them as people, to influence the ways that they think about sport, to understand contextual factors within their environments, things like power dynamics, dare I say it, ecological dynamics, different ways of designing coaching programs, different conceptualizations of skill and skill acquisition. Uh, Sometimes where I get a little bit pushback from students. I deliver quite sports science orientated stuff. And I go, oh, this is my first experience of it. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know how to map out and define the demands of my sport. You're talking a different language to me, Andy. And they don't engage and maybe complain as a result as well. This isn't anything to do with my coaching context. Whereas I'm sitting there on the other side of the fence and, well, you should know these things. Let's expose you to different ways of thinking. And that often brings with it tension as well, because if we present a vision of the world that's very different to the context that a coach works in, then there's sometimes tension, there's sometimes conflict. But it's about seeing the world in different ways. And that's kind of what I would do, is invest heavily in fewer coaches. And what is, on the other side, what is the purpose of coach education? To an extent, it's to ensure coaches. It's to ensure they've ticked a box to show that they've demonstrated a minimal level of competence. I'm not sure that the qualifications do that, but yeah. So it would be more a social system in which we target specific, almost like the gold mine effect type things. Let's focus on individual groups, individual clubs, and grow discourses from that. But recognition that that takes years to do. We're not saying immediate delivery of metrics that way. It's like my job. So there's one coach I'm thinking about who's quite a high profile athlete as well, who said, Andy, you've changed my way of thinking about how I coach. Uh, and you've encouraged me to go on to do further study as well. He's working with how many, maybe 30, 40 other athletes. He's also sufficiently high profile for people to listen to him, which is important in terms of behavior change. Who you are is more important than what you say in sport, unfortunately. Uh, so that can I measure the impact of me working with him? No, I can't. Just got nice anecdotes to say you've made a big difference to me. And that's what we see on the program, that lots of coaches are saying, you've changed the way I think about how I coach. And then they go out into their environments and maybe change that environment slightly. Do we see increases in performance and participation as a result of these interactions? Not in any measurable forms. And therein lies the tension. It's a bit metaphysical, if you will. We can't necessarily always see the impact of things we do, but we're working in a system that expects deliverables of KPIs, many of which aren't deliverable, they're unachievable goals.
Yeah, so where I resonate, you talk about ecological dynamics. Obviously, I'm obviously
I'm
picking
just
up on that.
poking the bear. I'm just poking.
No, no need to poke. But not. I'm not necessarily going to talk about that necessarily. But I think one of the, if you look at the sort of some of the underpinning theoretical ideas around or assumptions, sort of rooted in ecological psychology and to a certain extent some of the dynamical systems stuff, where it kind of takes you to is a sort of, more of a kind of like complex or complexity embracing view of human development.
Hmm.
And this is one of the things that attracts me to it, because I think just to sort of talk about some of the fundamental assumptions that exist around talent development, and for that matter, sport development, by the way, um, is that sport development, I think, has been captured for quite a while. Sport development and therefore talent development, because the sort of two things go hand in hand. Talent development is almost a sort of subset of sport development. But if you think about some of the underlying ideas and assumptions that sort of have permeated sport development, and again, I don't know if this is necessarily because there's been any sort of master plan necessarily. I think it's sort of the winds of political change that necessarily bring this around. But if you look at some of the underpinning ideas, it's actually quite reductionist
Mm.
in its sort of central idea, which is, almost sort of going down this sort of and quite mechanistic as well. So it's the way pathways have emerged is almost to say, well, and for that matter, systems and the systematization of talent development has moved in a direction where sports are asked, in order to justify their resources that would be placed within them, whether they're human or cash or whatever it might be. The system is designed to say this: you should have a pathway slash system with these ingredients in it. Firstly, you've got to have a blueprint or an architecture, usually in the form of some kind of pyramid style diagram, which bears actually no reflection of an actual journey that a human
Mm.
or group of humans would go on, but nonetheless creates a smart visual of how individuals might develop or how a system might be built. Again, once you're designing the architecture of a system, you're immediately almost not really considering the people within it. So that's fundamentally, I think, a bit of a flaw.
Mm.
And then because once you've built that blueprint and you've got that architecture and you've sort of started to create this almost to a certain extent sort of factory approach to the development of talent, you're immediately going to force human beings to fit within that model. So that there's an immediate tension there.
Mm.
Um,
Absolutely.
and it's one of the reasons why so many talent systems don't really deliver on the outcomes that they're looking for, because the reality is that the vast majority of talented individuals emerge around those systems, not necessarily through them. That's a massive overgeneralization, because there are products of the systems that do emerge as well. I'm not saying it doesn't work that way, but I would say that there's been a lack of sophistication in the way individuals or in the way talent systems are measured in terms of their output. And I think if someone was to properly critically evaluate talent systems, I don't think they don't deliver the output that actually they should deliver if they were supposed to work as well as they should. And I think there's a lot of survivorship bias, and I think there's a lot of other
But then
dimensions to it.
what is the output? Because there's limited funding. There's always going to be limited funding.
Mm.
Uh, Success means having more people going through the system to an extent, but there's
Yeah.
limited places. The further you go up, the fewer the places there are. And to achieve the ultimate metric, say when we use Olympic medals, there might only be one Olympic medal available in that domain, and only 8 people that can be in that Olympic final in the world. So that uh, even if we get more people going through the system and develop a more uh, a system where people are performing at a higher level, nothing much changes because the level of failure because of uh, funding and available podium places remains the same. So
My view on a talent system, though, is not necessarily. So I don't necessarily see the outcome of a talent system or the output of a talent system being, like meddling necessarily.
do we even want a talent system though, Stu? Or do we want lots of little ecosystems throughout the country from which people emerge and we
Well,
support people within these ecosystems to uh, define success on their own terms?
now that's good, right? We'll go back to that. Just hold that thought because I think that's really important because that's sort of partly where my mind is going as well. But just to sort of centralize a little bit on where we are with what we've got, the system that is designed, as we said before, and that's a flawed concept. The idea of the development of a system. Um, uh, in itself. But if you were to evaluate it properly, does it deliver? And your question you rightly ask is, well, what is the output? What should we be saying is the output? And I think a lot of people will see the output is yes, the medaling or this, that, and the other, or the number of people achieving international representation in team sports or
Mm,
whatever it is. My view's always been is actually a talent system is successful if it is delivering an oversupply. So, for example, if it is providing enriching and meaningful experiences for the humans within it so that more of them are able to self actualize or maximize their potential, which then gives um, whoever the decision makers are around selection for whatever it is that whether it's junior representation, international representation, whatever it might be, they have a headache because
mm.
there's more of those people than there were previously. That would
Uh,
be, and now I'm not saying that's
uh,
the right measure. I'm just saying that's our measure that, and it should be about, and I don't think these so-called systems, with the amount of resources put into them, deliver on that
mm,
promise
no.
any more than if those systems didn't exist.
Absolutely. And do you know what? The picture in my head is of a deep fried fish. I'm a vegetarian. A deep fried fish down at the beach with a bunch of seagulls flocking around it, trying to get their juicy bit of cod and batter down in Portobello Prom, just outside Edinburgh. That's the picture I've got. That there's this prize, which is the deep fried bit of fish, a bunch of crazy seagulls fighting, pecking each other's eyes out. If we can think about them more so as entitled parents.
Mhm.
I use that very carefully because not every parent's like that, and it's not a them and us mentality I'm thinking about either. Uh, but there's a whole lot of people competing over this same thing, and if they don't get their piece of fish, uh, they're not happy and they're angry at the system, and they're challenging the system because there's this belief that uh, they're entitled to something through and from the system. So we're developing cultures of expectation, of entitlement, of flawed beliefs. Uh, and even that if you work hard, then you're going to be successful. No, no, that's not the case. You've got to be in the right social conditions, have the right inherent talent, have a bit of luck, and again, there might be life experiences which make you pathologically driven to move to the next level. That hunger. It's saying, I want this bit of fish more than anyone else, so I'm going to fight every other seagull, to ensure I get the biggest bit of fish. And that's the way I often see the system operating. Just a
Yeah,
bunch of seagulls fighting over a fish.
I think you're right. I mean, I think you described the seagulls as maybe the parents. I describe the seagulls as the organizations, and
Mm,
the fish is the resources or the funding that's available. And I think often that's the fight. Or sometimes it can be organizations within, and also if you take the fish as being the athletes, then very often the organizations are fighting over a finite pool
Mm,
of athletes, and that what they're trying to do is they're trying to pick off the athletes to come into their system, which is one of the reasons why talent systems have got younger and younger, because the thinking is we have to get them before the other sports get them.
absolutely. It's a race to the bottom. I had that particular discussion with a head of academy at a football club. Uh, I'm thinking about how much I can say because I don't want to reveal identity. Uh, but my question is, why do you want to develop your academy to the next level when we know that primarily they're failing? And his view was that unless, so he suggested their system might have been a bit better than the other clubs, but the fact was that they weren't getting any of the athletes coming in as 16-year-olds because other clubs had got them before, so that they weren't able to get the athletes when they were 16 because the system existed where all the other clubs had got them. So he accepted it was a failing system and a race to the bottom, but simply to exist, they had to play the same game as everyone else, which was quite saddening. In fact, is he understood these things. That was quite insightful, and he was ready to answer my challenging questions on why would you want to do that in the first place, and he had a really good answer that actually changed my way about thinking about it.
It's interesting though that the same organizations that are so driven to hoover up talent, what they consider to be talent, younger and younger and younger. And I'm not just talking about football here, by the way. I'm
No,
talking about across the set, cross system, are also perfectly happy to hemorrhage it by virtue of either really quite injudicious selection systems with extremely poor um, athlete engagement, athlete involvement, athlete voice, athlete choice, and or by virtue of hemorrhage that talent by virtue of a lack of, and this goes back to what you were talking about earlier on, a lack of really high quality knowledge amongst the practitioners in those environments around adolescent development and health, well-being, physiological development, biopsychosocial, as you've talked about earlier on, and that lack of knowledge leading to injury or burnout or all these other
absolutely.
areas. So let's just keep hoovering up at the bottom as many as possible because we know we're going to break them. We want as many as possible so that the ones that break are less of an impact and we've got the other ones through. My view is like, why? Why would you invest all that time and be so careless with the this gold that you've accumulated? Why would you just allow it to fritter away? It doesn't make sense.
It
It's
does.
really, yeah, sorry.
We're seeing it in one of my sports. I'm saying one of my sports. I've got three now. So I've got cycling, which was golf and triathlon. But cycling was my first love, and I'm part of that environment and worked quite closely in that sport. And what we've seen over the last 10 years is a huge shift in the age group of riders winning at World Tour and Pro Tour level to being much younger. So you would typically get 28, 29, 30, 31. And now we're getting 19, 20, 21, 22-year olds, but their careers are much shorter. They're having less fulfilled careers, and the impact on their health and well-being uh, is more pronounced too. So they've got less of a sustainable career. And almost a wee bit like golf, in fact, as well. I'll talk about golf. Uh, I'll sound like an old bloke now, which I am, uh, but it's not as enjoyable to watch the sport as an observer because the base is much wider. The systems have become much more structured, much more metric driven, and you've not got players like Sevi and Lee Trevino coming out and swashbuckling and all these types of things. Uh, uh, and it's not as much fun for the viewer to watch. People are th it, things are going behind paywalls as well. We've got that issue where to watch the Tour de France this year, it's 31.99 on TNT. Which is uh, quite a big thing. There's petitions going, all the petitions going up in the cycling community saying we need to legislate so that we get it on free to view. Yeah, that's going to take up the government time, isn't it? But these are the sorts of environments that are developing, and people are actually walking away from watching the sport as well, so that the maybe we're getting a slow rot of the systems too. It's more difficult to watch, therefore it'll be more difficult to make money. Uh, we'll have less people coming through at grassroots level. So there's lots of things going on, but athletes being younger and younger is definitely not a good thing. It's almost like in my world of higher education, I came to higher education as a 30-year-old. It was joyful.
Mm.
Every opportunity to do anything, I was doing it. Every lecture was a privilege. I was hungry uh, for knowledge. And now I often describe, I better be careful what I say here, but sometimes lecturing to rows of cabbages, in which it takes so much investment to engage with young people in meaningful ways as well. And I think, or this relates to the chapter I've written. I'll do a segue so I'm not going off on multiple tangents. I talk about a word, salutogenesis. Now I'm sounding really academic now, but salutogenesis, the basis of that word is posing questions around what makes and keeps people healthy. What does a healthy environment look like? What are the factors that influence good health? So that's what my chapter is about, exploring my life course, things that have made me healthy in some regards and allowed me to manage some of the stresses in the sporting milieu. Uh, and there's three words there. Well, there's a few overarching principles, and one sense of coherence. And under that sense of coherence is meaningfulness. It's one word. So the motivations uh, of individuals. So where do they get their satisfaction from life from? What's their orientation towards particular tasks? How do they engage in those tasks? And what intrinsic rewards do they get from doing them? Uh, the Another word within sense of coherence is comprehensibility. How do individuals see the world? How do they appraise stress? And thus, how do they cope with stress in particular environments? So a high level of comprehensibility allows us to cope more effectively in the environment. So coming back to the golf course analogy, I'm thinking about the third hole on my golf course. Uh, there's an out of bounds right the way down this par five, and uh, the slope goes down towards the out of bounds. I'm not going to die if my ball goes out of bounds, but if I focus on it, uh, it probably is going to go in that direction. Uh, we're going into that challenger threat type thing. It's not a threat. I'm in a beautiful place. There's lovely trees. The cherry blossom's been out and it's just dropped. I'm having a lovely time. So does it matter? So that's my stress coping response. And more often than not, uh, I'll keep it in bounds. Uh, and that's the same for many things in life. How do we appraise the environment we're in? Is it a positive one for us? Do we see it as meaningful to us? Does it motivate us? And then there's the manageability. How do we manage in that environment? How do we develop? So again, that's the adaptation process. How able are we to adapt within that environment? And we could probably bring in the eco-D to that, is how able are we to deal with the constraints within that environment. And a wider concept within the theory is general resistance resources. We could talk about that as affordances. Where do we draw our energy from? Is it individual? Is it individual coping responses? How have they developed through our life course? And what are the external factors? Who can we draw on to help us when we're unable to cope? Do we have adequate support structures? Are they providing things that are actually helpful to us? I would say the dog's probably my greatest general resistance resource because she's absolutely dependent on me. I love her deeply, and she helps me cope with the stresses in my life because after this, I'll have to go up, have a stretch, take the dog out for a wee, have a chat with and a play with the dog, and I'll come back refreshed. So if we think about sense of coherence, I would suggest how do we develop that sense of coherence, that umbrella term for all these words, in the sporting environment? And when things go wrong, where can we draw upon to help people adapt more effectively? I would argue that where sport has often gone, and we talked about gymnastics off air, was uh, a negativity bias in sport and sporting systems. So we're looking at not developing healthy environments, we're looking at preventing harm and risk. And that's very different. How do you prevent bad things happening uh, and using a lot of resource on safeguarding and various processes, procedures, and policies to stop bad things happening? What if we flipped that on its head and said, how do we help or support good things happening? In a report from the Scottish Football Association, I'm trying to think how many years ago that came out now. For example, there was child abuse going on at Celtic Football Club with a coach, and it affected lots of people, and there was a big report, and the government was involved because it was football and it was Scotland. Uh, and one of the recommendations in that was to promote autonomy support climates where athletes had appropriate voice, uh, so that they weren't operating in these controlling environments where the coach screams instructions from the sidelines and is seen as an authority figure in which you're unable to challenge. We've had a story in the papers over the last few days of a similar thing in swimming. Uh, and without interrogating that too much, I would suggest that an autonomy support climate didn't exist there. But to develop that climate takes time. It takes wider systems in schools as well to equip young people to deal with and cope with autonomy. That's often what a challenge we face in the higher education system. And there's been a recent study out on that, that students are coming into the higher education system going, I've not been given autonomy for my own learning before, and you're expecting me to uh, deal with that really, really quickly. They can't cope with it. They're struggling and they're failing to engage as a result. So the easy thing for me to do as someone working in higher education is to blame secondary schools, and then secondary schools will blame primary schools, and everyone will blame the parents too. Uh, but if we fundamentally changed the question to what creates a healthy learning environment, or what creates a healthy performance environment, it's about developing these things, the comprehensibility, the understanding, the stress appraisal, the uh, manageability of these things. So how do we create environments to promote appropriate stress coping responses? Uh, the reason I reached out to you was I was listening to one of your dog walk commentaries in which you challenged Dave Collins's stuff on trauma, and that's why I reached out to you. I was thinking, uh, in my life and in my career, by definition, or I'll ask you first, what's your definition of trauma? What do you think it is?
Um, for me, it's a uh, sort of a deeply negative experience that then leaves lasting damage, whether it's emotional, psychological, physical, but it leaves lasting damage or harm.
Mm. So I would think that's maybe where the difference in thinking is coming from for me as well. In that I was thinking lots of things in my life have been quite traumatic. So really, my definition is around them being distressing events which have been unable to cope with, uh, that have caused a lot of distress. Uh, so they've occurred in working environments. Uh, I'm sure you've experienced some of these things getting home from work, thinking, I'm unable to cope with this experience, or I'm distressed by this, or I feel really helpless as a result of those interactions within my day, and I'm not equipped to deal with these. And I've often felt these things throughout my career. Uh, and I think that they're a normal part of life. I've studied Buddhism too, and one of the central tenets of Buddhism is that suffering is inevitable. Everyone suffers. It's part of being human. But it's how we deal with that suffering, how we appraise it, and how we grow from it. Now, I had a good chat with Professor Andy Lane a while ago on emotion and emotion regulation. And I'm trying to think where the work he was drawing on, but he's saying from an evolutionary psychology perspective, if emotions weren't helpful in on an evolutionary basis, humans wouldn't have them. So that, say, we go back to caveman or cavewoman experiences, and we've just been attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, and we find it deeply traumatic. We've had a chunk taken out our leg, it hurt. We think we might die as a result. What do? We withdraw. We think we think about strategies to deal with that saber-tooth tiger when we emerge from our cave, or pit of despair, if you will. Uh, I'll use a personal example. Just after during COVID, yeah, as we were emerging from COVID, uh, I had fast developing cataracts, which meant my eyesight went down to 636, which is partially sighted. And as an academic, being partially sighted, being unable to uh, read very well and being exhausted by midday was deeply distressing. It was deeply traumatic. Uh, it impacted on me. But what's grown from that experience after getting it fixed is, uh, well, an appreciation of what it's like to have a disability and the things within society that are difficult to negotiate, like crossing a road where someone's parked selfishly on the pavement or something like that. I've become quite engaged with that. It makes me annoyed, but it also gives me deep joy. So saw uh, a gold crest bird the other day. There was over a year that there was one day I saw someone walking towards me and I thought they had a dog and it was actually a suitcase. So that those deeply distressing uh, circumstances often help us grow and grow stronger and take deeper meaning from life. And some of my negative experiences in and through sport give me the drive to do what I do, to put meaning and motivation into my life and help me grow as a practitioner. Uh, and it's idealistic to think the world is such that bad things don't happen to people. Bad things sometimes help us grow. The word salutogenesis came from a medical sociologist called Aaron Antonovsky. They've always got a name like that, haven't they? And his observations and development of the theory came from his work with Holocaust survivors. And what he observed was how resilient many Holocaust survivors were, despite the adversity that they've experienced uh, in life, where they draw meaning from, how they draw uh, positive energy from uh, their wider community and such. And that's where the theory emerged from. So that if we think about trauma, or many words in a neutral capacity, we talk about learning in such a way as well. You can have positive, neutral, negative. Same with trauma. It's what emerges from the experience that may help us adapt to deal with future challenges within life. And what I think we're seeing in society at the moment is young people struggling to cope. Maybe the environments, almost like vacuums, have meant that uh, they've not had to make decisions for themselves. They've not had to deal with challenging uh, experiences like maybe I did as a kid, being chucked out the door uh, as a 6-year-old with your mates and getting up to all sorts of nonsense through to being a teenager living in a working class community where there's basically gang warfare with the other parts of the town and other towns where we're hanging about street corners and a car would go past and they're throwing things at us and fighting and all these things going on. So that's the environment that I was brought up in, and you seeing how hierarchies develop in those environments. You've got the hard man, the top boy. Uh, us kids are aspirational to the top boy who's the hardest. And stature is determined on how hard you are in some of these environments. Uh, that can be quite traumatic at times as well. I don't think young people are maybe not exposed to those extremes, but they're not exposed to the sorts of things people of our generation were. and as a result, they're less able to appraise and deal with stress appropriately and manage it. So that if we think about trauma as a neutral word that can help us grow, to help us deal more effectively with stress in the future, that's a bit different to thinking about it wholly as a negative event. And I would say that I wouldn't necessarily want to engineer traumatic experiences within a developmental trajectory of a young person. Uh, but you know, and I know that part of a major part of life is uh, failing, being excluded, being treated with disrespect, getting into arguments, having conflict, people telling you you're not good enough. Uh, and sometimes these things are justified. I've got to do that in my job sometimes. The students say, your work is not of the required standard. Uh, I'm suggesting or recommending you don't progress or you don't get this qualification because I don't think you've achieved that standard. That's very typical to what young people will experience when they go out into a working environment. Uh, they may work in Tesco's or Sainsbury's where they've got a bullying boss. They need to be able to deal with that. They need to appraise that and deal with it appropriately. And what I think we're seeing now is young people less able to deal with these things and lashing out and not able to cope with challenging environments.
Yeah, or young people are saying we don't want to inhabit environments that require us to have to navigate this level of negativity in our life. We want to inhabit environments where, you know, so it's interesting though, a lot of what you've said there, I think is an interesting reflection on again the status quo. And I'm again going back to sort of challenging some of these assumptions. So there's a lot to unpack. So just forgive me for a second while I do it. Your point, you make a good point, which is, there's no doubt that challenging, difficult, um, maybe traumatic. Again, what the bar of trauma is, I don't know. But let's say, let's take this whole let's group challenging, difficult, suffering elements let's call them under this umbrella of sort of traumatic experiences. Can elicit growth. And lots been written about that. Lots and lots of, it's a central thesis of Dweck's work around the growth mindset, struggle,
Mm.
challenge, difficulty, getting it at the right sweet spot, and all those sorts of things can solicit growth, can be developmental, can create people on a, and a lot of coaching in my mind is getting that sweet spot, finding the
Mm,
right level of challenge point.
absolutely.
And that's the skill of it. Now, and but it can just as easily be debilitating and elicit extremely negative experiences that people find it extremely difficult to overcome. And then that leads to all sorts of other debilitating experiences. Only a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to a mother whose child had experienced a fairly savage deselection process. And their response to, and the part of the deselection process, the feedback given was about physical stature linked to maturation, and the response in the child was an eating disorder. So
Mhm.
these are the consequences that can happen, right, as a
Absolutely.
result,
Absolutely.
a
Yeah.
result of that. And I guess my thesis in my meanderings in the dog walk was around this idea of actually, if we go out there with a message to suggest talent needs trauma, right? I think we've got to be much more judicious with our language, right? And I would have thought, most academics
Yeah.
would recognize that. And I know, but I'm just trying to say that I know that's not the central thesis of necessarily of the message behind the actual work, but you've got to be careful with slogans because they capture
a-
imagination, particularly
absolutely.
amongst individuals who aren't necessarily that well versed to actually read the detail. And that's the danger. Right? The danger is a slogan's capturing. The other thing, though, I would say though is that a lot of that work feeds into the performance narrative, which we've been lamenting, right? Which is talking about the idea that there is something inherently valuable in the idea that these sorts of experiences, and I'm not sure that that necessarily is the case. I want to challenge that assumption. I think we've worked on the basis that the only route for to self-actualization, whatever that looks like, is through this sort of this sort of overcoming hardship approach.
No,
Now,
yeah, yes and no. Uh,
I
can
know,
I
but
can I
what
come
I'm trying
back
to
to
say,
the theory, Stu, and say
yeah,
so Antonovsky talked about uh, the river of life, much as the way Dave talks about the rocky road,
yeah.
uh,
I like
and
Antonovsky's description better than the Rocky Road, but anyway, I might be
uh,
biased.
yeah, I'm laughing. Uh, but if we prepare, or if we try to prevent children and young people ever entering the river, and then they find themselves in it, they're going to struggle even on the meandering uh, bits of that river. Whereas but in life, we've got to go down these meandering bits. I'll link it back to some wider psychiatric definitions of a dynamic equilibrium. So it's a moving dynamic equilibrium of adaptation. It's forever changing, much as a river does. So sometimes there'll be times of peace and tranquility, and uh, the river's moving slowly, and we're content, and everything's fine. And before we know it, we've fallen down a waterfall, bumped our head on a rock. Then we're going down a fast-moving current, and so on. Uh, and life and sport is like that river. My life's like that. I'm sure your life's like that. Uh, Seeing colleagues who have recently been made redundant on LinkedIn and things like that. So profound changes in their lives too that are like going down this river. So that if we don't prepare young people to navigate that river successfully, where there's times of adversity, times of challenge, occasionally times of trauma, uh, then the consequences are much worse. Uh, and I'm seeing in my working environment, uh, young people less able to deal with criticism, uh, with challenge, with failure, of lashing out, of blaming others. And I think the evidence is suggesting it's not just me that's thinking that way, that there's a general feeling that young people are really struggling at the moment. Uh, and part of that is that many have not learnt to navigate the river sufficiently to cope with the challenges that life throws at them. Uh, and I suppose that's central to what I would suggest about any sporting environment is we should be helping people grow, adapt, deal with challenge, recognize that injury happens, that crashes happen, that other people might be nasty to you. That well, I've worked with performance directors and head coaches that are very similar to those that we've seen in the uh, abuse cases in the newspapers, and it's had consequences on me. Thinking about challenging one coach in particular, where I nearly lost my job because of the power dynamics, because I was saying, this is all physical development in this environment. That's all they're doing. It's like a Trojan work ethic. Where's the skill acquisition? Where's the other things going on in that environment? And I nearly lost my job for saying that in a high performance environment because I was challenging the head coach. So that's often the reality of the environments people exist within. And that makes me really sad. I don't want coaches like that to be operating in these environments. what the sad reality is with the current narrative. That's kind of how it is in many environments. So that,
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm with you on this in the sense that I'm not suggesting that um, equipping. I mean, I've talked about this with thesis before. I think I've talked about the idea of sort of
mm,
climbing a mountain wearing a pack. I don't think young people in particular, as they go on this developmental journey, are being equipped with the right tools to be able to navigate effectively. Now, some of that's to do with the fact that, they're children, right? So why
mm,
would they be? Why would they
yeah,
be equipped? But only the parents who are the caregivers of the child, and the parent-child is symbiotic. So you shouldn't really. I mean, whenever you hear a sport talking about parents being a problem, right?
mm,
No, no, no. As parent and the child, they are one until such time as the child is suitable to be able to start to make some of their own decisions, which obviously happens later
absolutely.
in life, which is one of the reasons you would really only ever want talent systems to happen much later in adolescence when children have begun to be able to start to make life decisions, like, for example, making choices about what careers they might do and then changing subjects at school. Whether or not you agree with the timing that happens in a schooling system, fundamentally
Mm,
we've decided that's the right time for them to start to make some decisions about their future. Anyway, so it should happen a lot later, and that would be beneficial. Reality
mm,
is that doesn't happen. So I really like this salutogenic thesis, by the way, this idea of actually let's not just be dealing with treatment or artificial preventative measures, right, which happen a lot as well.
mm,
Let's actually look at a really enriched experience for young people, which will enable them to uh, develop the sort of capabilities. And part of that is support and helping them to navigate some of these challenging experiences. Because one of the other central theses around the sort of, the sort of the trauma hypothesis really is that even in the Great British Medalist Project, these people who experienced traumatic experiences, who then went on to become super medalists, all had extremely supportive environments that enabled them to make sense of what had happened and then use that as fuel for further development. Right now,
mm,
so that is a key component. If that doesn't exist, then that sometimes can be a really problematic situation. And in some cases with young people who are having some of those experiences, it's the parents are kind of part of the problem in some cases because you do sometimes see parents who are either semi-absent to some of the emotional needs of young people, but then the minute that young person experiences some challenge, they come piling in, wanting to fire blame everywhere, at coaches and this, that, and the other. So that becomes a huge problem. So I'm totally sort of on board with this idea that we need to develop. But again, this comes back to the point, right? And it's again central thesis of this podcast and why I set it up in the first place, which is that talent coaches, in my view, are very often massively overlooked and under-resourced.
absolutely.
In the sense that they bear a huge responsibility for navigating and supporting and guiding journeys for young people going through huge amounts of change. It's a key critical component, and yeah, they're never given the level of resource and support
No.
that they should have in order to be able to do this, and they don't even have some of the core basic requisite knowledge to be able to help those people. So I think there's a really important message to be made here, which is that, and this goes back to your point around instead of just continuously putting barriers in place or more things for coaches to do, and this was a central feature of the research I was doing on strategy and policy, more things to do, which give the artifice of safety, more DBS checks, more safeguarding courses, more first aids, more this, more that, more the other. Instead of doing all of that, put the genuinely supportive systems in place to the people with this awesome
Absolutely.
responsibility for athlete health, do coach development properly, and then not you do two or three things. You give the athletes the capability to be able to sort of go through this developmental journey with the right level of support. The people responsible for the developmental journey, or at least the guide by the side on the developmental journey, is better equipped to help them navigate.
Mm,
So both parties are equally protected from anything, overly harmful occurring, which then
Absolutely.
is what gives rise to all these headlines. So my view
Absolutely.
is, and this is what I've been lobbying for ages, is that when I'm talking about coach education is broken, I'm coming at it from the perspective of let's forget the idea that we need to educate coaches into oblivion in order to prevent harm and to create this. It doesn't work and it isn't doing the job you're expecting it to do. Let's start to rethink the way coach support happens.
Mm.
Coaches will have better experiences. Athletes will have better experiences. If you only care about medals, you'll get better outputs anyway. It's the ultimate win-win proposition. But it's going to take resources and it's going to take a new, different way of thinking.
I think though, I think there's often what in discussions is, oh, we need more resource, or we need more resource allocated in this particular area. And I would maybe take a different approach. I would say we need to use the available resource more effectively
Yeah.
to have uh, impact. Uh, I'm thinking as well. So we've got the mental health discourse that's become popularized over the last 10 years or so. And then if we look at the mechanisms of support and how they work, that's broadly not successful either. There's been things like developing mental health literacy to help the stress coping response of young people in sport. Uh, but if we look at where that literacy comes from, it comes from DSM-5, which is the psychiatric Bible, if you will, of taxonomy and nosology of how we define mental health, much of which isn't evidence-based, first of all. And secondly, if we look at the growth of mental health literacy, what else has grown? Uh, Prevalence and use of pharmacological agents and mental health has not got better. So that system isn't necessarily working. So they're saying, oh, we're supporting athletes by promoting mental health and saying it's important. If we come back and say, well, what are the mechanisms and mediating factors that influence change? How does this help athletes become more mentally healthy? Then the evidence is pretty clear that it doesn't. Uh, if people are referred on, they're lucky if they get a 6-week course. If they need to go into the healthcare system for support, good luck you unless you're about to die or commit suicide, because it's unlikely you'll get support anyway, and that often makes things worse. So my argument is that we need to support these talent development coaches and performance directors and such to be able to create environments to allow people to adapt and prosper. And that means perhaps taking resource away from safeguarding, uh, from mental health literacy courses, all these add-ons that we know don't really work, and invest in that in appropriate coach development. And something that I'm really aware of in my world is not to be judgmental of coaches either. Uh, so there's almost a tension in my mind that some of the coaches I work with, I'm astounded at what they don't know, thinking, how do you not know that? You're working on a talent pathway, you're working on an Olympic program, or you're working in a really big school supporting a few thousand children, and you don't know that, or you don't understand this. But the humble side of me says, well, as a physiologist, I was working with Olympic level athletes sometimes and hadn't studied the endocrine system at any level. I didn't know much about psychology. There was all these things that weren't in my toolbox as someone working with athletes at a very high level to their detriment. So I need to reflect on my own life course and what I didn't know and how these things changed over that life course, which really is what uh, probably a 50-year-old, I'm starting to say, ah, I think I'm getting there. I think uh, I'm quite confident in calling myself a wee bit of an expert here. I've not got this imposter syndrome anymore. I'm actually quite good at what I do, rather than this overinflated ego that thought, oh, I've got a PhD, I've worked with Olympians and all this, I must be awesome. There was that period of despondency when I started to be exposed to new things and new ways of thinking and uh, different ways of developing people and going, oh my goodness, how bad was I? In that period of thinking, how bad was I? And as a coach educator as well, and some of the rubbish that I delivered on courses, I mean rubbish, uh, that was making young people worse. I was that person infecting the minds of uh, other coaches simply because of the t-shirt I was wearing, and I didn't have a clue what I was talking about. So that's really important in how I appraise other coaches as well, that not to be judgmental. I've been them, and that's where part why I'm speaking to you as well, that I really care deeply about the professionalization of coaches, much in the way that we look at general practitioners in medicine, because it's that complex, it's that difficult a job. You're engaging with complex organisms on a daily basis, and every word you say or don't say can have a profound influence on the rest of someone's life. That's the responsibility I have of a coach. So an offhand comment about weight without a deeper understanding of that athlete can be a trigger for something really bad happening. Uh,
I,
uh, uh,
I agree. I mean, and look, I like I'm your point about resources is a really good one, well made actually, which is the idea of where do we allocate resources. You made me think actually of a sports organization that I'm working with at the moment, and I was actually talking to them about resources and available resources because, of course, you always get sort of pushback. I'd love to do all of this, but I haven't got the resources. And it's really about allocation of resources and
yeah,
decision making. And actually, this goes back to your point actually about um, having compassion for the coaches because it's not their fault that they don't know stuff. It's the fact that we have policies and resource allocations which say that good enough is good enough, and it's not. It's just not. We're not equipping the people to be able to do the job they need to do. It's the equivalent, going back to your point about the river of life, but it's the equivalent of saying, we're going to basically take a junior doctor, relatively newly sort of qualified, and throw him into heart surgery.
mm,
It's a bit of an extreme example, but it's not dissimilar. So I think there's a major issue there. But going back to your point about safeguarding, and I was having a conversation with somebody, and I was saying, how many people are working in safeguarding in your organization, and what's their budget? And it's twice the size of the coach development budget,
yeah.
and it's twice the size in terms of the amount of people. So we've got all this resource going into complaint handling and training courses and more barriers, which basically affect the practitioner and mean less and less people are
Mm,
going into those roles, which is becoming self-defeating. So what you get again is the people who stay in the world of coaching are the ones who are prepared to go through and jump through all the hoops. Whereas in actual fact, so you lose really good coaching talent because quite a lot of people are like, I don't want to be part of that world. Or at the very least, they then operate in the grey. In the grey, what people call the grey market, they operate
mm.
outside the qualification system, which is a damning indictment.
Uh,
But there's also
can
something
I
really
use it?
important I wanted to say actually, which I think speaks to your thesis. One of the benefits, I think, and this is a shift in thinking, one of the benefits in working for Sport England was you get to meet some really amazing people, these
Yeah,
brilliant social entrepreneurs doing really great things. One I got to meet, uh, Lance Thomas, who has set up a little micro charity called Self-Guarding, partly because of her experiences as an athletics coach.
yeah.
Um, and self-guarding is the idea of, instead of saying, right, we're going to almost take this paternalistic approach to the protection of children by saying, you adults need to jump through this hoop and that hoop in order to be determined safe to practice, which does not work, really does not, or at least doesn't work as well as we would hope it would do. creating this Finkelhorn's walls, create walls to stop people getting in. What's the point of that, right? You want people to be in, to be just being equipped better.
Mm,
Self-guarding is the idea that what we do is we take the young people in experience and we give them the support and resources and their parents and caregivers to be able to navigate through these worlds and actually point out when things are happening that aren't necessarily going to be aligned
absolutely,
to the disease.
absolutely, and
That's, I think, where the sort of
that's
salutogenesis thesis comes from.
that's what the SFA report was saying as well, that we need to empower people within those environments to say when things are wrong and not from a complaining type perspective, because people do that. When I was trying to interrupt as well, but I'm glad I didn't. I was thinking of a particular safeguarding incident that kind of demonstrates some of the challenges in that there was a case of over prescription of training load for a particular uh, athlete uh, who had unrealistic expectations placed upon them. I can't say too much because I would reveal identity maybe. Uh, I spoke with the safeguarding officer at the national governing body, but in full knowledge that they probably wouldn't be able to do anything. But what the coach was doing was pretty consistent with the normalized ways of doing things within the system, and uh, what he was doing wasn't open for sanction through safeguarding processes. And then there was the legal aspect as well, that if the national governing body got that decision wrong, it could leave them open to litigation. This person ran a whole regional coaching program. Uh, Presenting harmful messages, and the safeguarding processes uh, couldn't be invoked in that particular circumstance because a certain bar hadn't been reached, despite the fact that it was affecting dozens uh, of young people. The other point I was going to make, and it relates to when we were talking about resources, I talk about the three C's as well, different three C's. We've got capabilities uh, of individuals in the environment uh, and coherence within that environment too. I've forgotten my third C, but the but it relates to resources. Uh, And an example I would use was that I was working with a highly capable individual who didn't achieve much in a particular organization with quite uh, a big workforce. Then this individual went over to take over a whole program at another national governing body within another country, in fact, and had one member of an admin team and delivered about 6 programs over 18 months with next to no resources because they had coherence
Mm,
within that environment, that
mm,
they could run that agenda, they could focus on what they wanted to focus in a coherent way and use resources appropriately so
yeah,
that the capability of individuals needs to be aligned with coherence within the organization. Uh, Another example would be in a football club that I worked with. The performance analysis staff weren't speaking to the physiologists come strength and conditioning staff, despite being in the same office. And my question was, how do you triangulate your data and feed that into the uh, coaching team? Well, we don't do that. So you've got 4 people as performance analysts, more as sports scientists, all operating in slightly different domains, monitoring training load in slightly different ways, and you're feeding information into the uh, coaching system, you're doubling the work of the coaches, and they're not buying in because you're not presenting coherent messages that they can use within uh, their coach decision making.
Mm,
Uh, so if I was your head of performance and coming in here, I would cut the workforce in half,
mm,
have half the resource and deliver it in a coherent way, ensuring you guys were on the edge of the pitch, speaking to the head coach, working with the coaching staff, collaborating, co-creating questions, co-creating projects to understand each other's perspectives so that you develop well, shared mental models, shared language, shared ways of doing that actually shifts the performance dial. And I think that's really important in all systems, that you need that level of coherence. Everyone focusing on the same sort of thing. In sport right now, we're going on a wee bit here, but you talked about the physical activity and sport agenda. They're really quite different things. Uh, can we do both? Are we diluting effectiveness by trying to do both? By putting a resource into physical activity when in fact organizations like Parkrun or community sport or pensioners clubs are doing equally, if not a better job at getting people active. Why do we not just detach these agendas? And the reason's obvious, is because that's included in the portfolio of the minister. Certainly in Scotland, that's their portfolio. Are you disagreeing?
well, sort of, in the sense that I actually think they're really compatible agendas. Um, Particularly when, if you look at the lens of the development of physical activity, and part of the way in which you foster um, a more physically active population is reducing barriers to access, tackling inequality, looking at it through an inclusive lens,
Mm,
finding the reasons why people can't engage. And my view is, I think many of the ideas that are sort of almost naturalized within what's often referred to as the sport for development world. So the sport for development world, where you're using sport as a vehicle for social change, you're dealing with social barriers, but in so doing, you also have to address these inequalities because otherwise you can't use
mm,
sport as the vehicle. And so people who operate in the sport for development world look at things through a very individualized and humanistic way because they
mm.
know that if they don't, they won't have the impact they're looking for.
Yeah.
And actually, I think the world of sport, which has been focused much more on the doing of the sport, which has then almost removed the human element out, and a lot of the stuff we've talked about around systems and everything else has been driven by the idea of almost like we're just taking these bodies and objects and just putting them through this system in order to try and get some kind of an output. And it becomes a little dehumanizing, and in some cases, a lot dehumanizing.
Mm,
I actually think the merging of those two worlds is really where the secret sauce is. And yes, okay, it might also happen to be a policy agenda, but I don't necessarily think that necessarily is a bad thing.
mm, mm. I'm not I'm not one to disagree, and I'm not going to say but. I'm not sure. It was Vinnie Webb always used to say, Andy, you always say but, which means something else is coming. Uh, I'm not sure really on my view of it, that things like, and I'm sure you'll agree with this, that did a bit of work with a charity called Youth Charter for Sport in Manchester.
Yeah, no,
And
yeah.
and uh, one of the things I discovered in that work was how the budgets for youth services in Manchester had decreased from, oh, I can't remember, I'm picking it out the air, but it was maybe an eight-figure sum uh,
Yeah.
to about £1 million.
Yeah.
So a huge decrease in community centres for youths where lots of really good activity went on. Uh, that charity focused on sport and the arts and integrating and understanding the actual communities in which young people existed. So Moss Side, East Clayton, quite divisive societies where there's gun crime, drugs, gang warfare, lots of things, fears of going into different areas. So really extreme barriers and very, very specific gender roles, which are very, very different to the world that I populate in which men are men and women are women. Uh, in that I think it was recognized that the girls wanted to do different things, uh, that they wanted to do things that we may, in the current climate, think, oh, that's uh, not appropriate uh, to make it so gender specific, but that's what these young people were wanting. What the girls were wanting, but what Jeff, the head of the charity, also realized was that typically it was the girls who were the best leaders who would control the boys quite effectively. And there, you would always find a few people in these environments who were natural leaders, and you would target your time and your investment in those people, much in the same way as a football manager will come in and see who's the most destructive in the dressing room, try and make them as an ally and reach the players that way. That's kind of Jeff's approach as well. So I see the benefits of all these things. I wonder though, within current structures, and this is maybe where I differ, that we need to differentiate between the roles of national governing bodies. I would like to see the role of national governing bodies going back to what it was maybe 15, 20, 25 years ago, where they would mm, do a level of coach education for sport orientated coaches. There would be the level of governance and regulation of the sport, and not a great deal else. Uh, and maybe investing more in the community groups and youth services and all these things to look at that physical activity agenda more. So I think the skills of national governing bodies and their capacity is far too diluted on too many agendas. And if we simplified that, it may make things better. I'm saying that from someone as an outsider of the system rather than someone inside. That's how I see it, and it's not necessarily evidence-based. It's based on perception. So I recognize that I might be misguided in some of the things I'm saying, or the evidence may confound what I'm saying. Uh, that's my perception, though, that maybe if we focused on funding for the core purpose of national governing bodies and maybe limiting that core purpose to what they did traditionally 20 years ago, and then using additional resources elsewhere. But I think
Mm.
the different systems, whilst they can be mutually, or whilst they can be exclusive, they can be compatible as well and can work together.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's personally, I think the more inclusive your sport is, the more chances you've got of achieving anything you want to achieve. You know, A, get more people participating, which is great. And B, you give more opportunities for people to be able to make progress if that's something that they achieve they want to do. So I think it's the tide that rises all boats.
Mm,
But I am very philosophically aligned to that way of thinking, and that's partly due to my own bias. He's linked to my own life course, so I can understand how that influences our thinking. Hey, look, we're coming up on 2 hours,
Ooh, that's
which is a
crazy.
which is
It's crazy.
a big one even for me. I've I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for reaching out, and thank you for sharing with me the research on salutogenesis. I think it's a really interesting way of thinking about many of the problems that we are presented with, and in many ways, I think going back to what we were saying earlier on, I think it encapsulates a lot of, as a lens through which to look at how can
Mm.
we rethink the way coaching happens, the way support is provided, the way talent is developed as an idea. I think there's
Uh,
a lot to
yeah.
unpack there. I
Uh,
really like it, so I really
uh,
appreciate you sharing it with me.
I'll end it on saying that the word was a light bulb moment for me. It was so damn obvious.
Mm,
Uh, Thinking about how we're driven by the negativity bias in many things we do in our lives as well as sport, and simply asking the question, what are the origins of health, uh, was absolutely transformational. I know, was it Harry Burns, the chief medical officer, a few years ago in Scotland, advocated that approach in hospitals as well, and it worked well in various educational establishments, generally in places like Holland and Scandinavia, where they're more progressive. Uh, but that simple orientation and reminding myself of it often when I go down that pathogenic uh, type direction, I remind myself, now what are we trying to achieve? How does what I'm saying help create a healthier environment for people? And it really is a transformational, almost a change of a philosophical way of seeing the world.
mm,
It's huge. And
mm,
there's a bit out there that listeners just Googling the word. Uh, there's a giant handbook as well on it that's free to access. It's a big Springer handbook, so the publisher Springer, so that quite high quality, and a lot of the writings on it are quite accessible. I think
mm,
it it's not really pervaded the discourse in North America and the UK as much as it has in the Scandic countries, Holland, Belgium, and such. So it's very European and North European centric, but there's political and philosophical things going on there, why it's more well received there and not so well received uh, in the UK. It's not a new thing. It's not novel. It's well accepted across many domains. It's just not pervading our uh, the social systems in which uh, we live.
yeah, I can understand that. Um, thank you for coming on and for as always a stimulating conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Me
Um,
too.
are you available for people to reach out to if, well, the last time apparently it stimulated all sorts of people getting in touch. I'm assuming you're still contactable. What's the best way for people to reach out?
Best way is either LinkedIn or it's easy to Google me, and my email at the university's publicly available. So I'm not going to give you specifics. If you really want to speak to me, you can find me quite easily.
Yeah, yeah. Got to do a bit of work to get access, so I get it.
Absolutely. It's not that difficult. Yeah.
Andy, thanks for a great chat.
Thank you very much. Cheers.